Everyone talks about growth, but not many people talk about what happens if it doesn't show up. Because a lot of the deals I'm seeing at the moment are costing people $400 plus a week to hold. And the way people justify it is they're going, growth will cover that. Maybe it will, but what happens if growth actually doesn't show up? Well, maybe the question people should be asking is, what if growth doesn't appear? What am I going to do then? What's my plan? The last few years have actually made this pretty easy to forget. People have got very used to seeing growth turn up pretty quickly, and that's kind of become the norm. But if you've been through a few cycles, you'll know that things don't always work out like that. And after periods of substantial growth, things can tend to go sideways for a while. And if you're paying out a fair chunk in cash each week, then that can actually really start to bite if you're not seeing growth show up to compensate you for it. I've seen people in this situation before where they're bought in on that expectation of getting growth and they're paying out a fair chunk of cash each week. And over time, when that growth doesn't start to show, they get very frustrated with that because they're pumping money in and not seeing that return come back. And in a lot of cases, they end up getting so frustrated they sell the property, usually at the worst possible time, or as luck would have it, sometimes just before the market's about to take off again. So the obvious question becomes, how do I invest for growth without digging myself into a cash flow hole? Let me show you something I recently came across. So I just wanted to share an example of a property that I've recently come across, just to give you a little bit of background on this particular property. The location it's in is actually doing, over the last 10 years, it's actually averaged 9.2% annual growth, which is pretty solid in terms of, if you look at a lot of the markets around the country, even though we've obviously had some fairly strong periods, when you average that out over 10 years, 9.2 is sort of getting right up there in terms of growth. The other thing in this market is that the vacancy rate is also very tight. It's currently sitting at about 0.7, but even over a longer period of time, it's still a very tight rental market. So that's continued to sort of keep fairly strong pressure on rents. And again, over the last 10 years, rents on average have grown by over 5% a year. So overall, pretty good market in terms of growth, but also in terms of the rental outlook as well. So just in terms of putting some numbers through this calculator, just to keep things a little bit more conservative, even though it's been 9.2, I'm going to dial that growth back to around 7%. So roughly at around that 7.2, that means your value's growing roughly about you're doubling your value every 10 years, but we'll just make it 7% for the sake of this exercise. But in terms of how that's performing, again, the key number that we keep looking at is this one at the bottom, which is basically, once we break it down to a weekly holding cost. So this one, for someone on an income of $150,000 after tax, that breaks down to $151 a week. And you can see as that sort of pans out over the next couple of years, that's starting to trend towards positive. It's getting pretty close to neutral about in 5 years' time, roughly about $88 a week. So, but overall, if you contrast that to looking at $400 a week plus, 151 gets pretty manageable. In fact, obviously, if you do the maths on that, if you can afford a property that's going to cost you $400 a week, you could potentially carry almost like 2 or 3 of these things. So, it's pretty manageable from that point of view, but also because you're still in that growth market. Like I said, it's been doing 9.2, but even if it does 7%, you can see over time that you're sort of building pretty reasonable equity over that period. And even if we drop that back to 6%, let's say, if the market was a bit flatter, you're still achieving pretty reasonable growth. But the main thing is, if you look here, like you're basically in that first year, let's say, if it does come out at 151, you're paying around close enough to $8,000 a year that's going out of your pocket. But your potential upside there is still about 44. So you've got a reasonable sort of return out of that. And even if it went particularly flat, like down to 4%, for example, you're still coming out ahead around about 21,000 against that 8. So even in a fairly low sort of sluggish market, you're still going to be basically coming out ahead in most cases. Obviously, if it went backwards, different story. But in a low growth market, you're still going to be okay. And even if it trended on that over the next couple of years, you're still going to come out well ahead, mainly because obviously you're not forking out a lot in terms of cash flow to hold that property. The other things just to have a look at as well, like if rates actually increased, like so let's say by a full 1% from where they are now, that would take your whole cost up to, $303 a week. So, basically getting close to about $16,000 a year. But even in that low growth market, you're still coming out ahead. Yes, okay, we're not printing money at that level, but still a fairly comfortable level. At least you're not sort of basically drowning at that point. And obviously, again, as you move forward, even though those funds are going out, over time you're still going to be going ahead. But obviously, if you're back to that 7%, then that's going to be a pretty reasonable return. So even if those rates do go up and you get that growth, you still got a pretty good margin in there. So I guess the key thing is looking at a property with that type of approach. Even if you get some sort of changes that move against you, like rates or whatever, overall, it's still going to be manageable through the tougher periods as well. And that's the key thing. It's not just a case of the numbers looking good when everything's good. It also means that even in a tougher market, in a slower market, it's still manageable. So that's the difference. You're still targeting growth. You're just not relying on it to show up day one to make those numbers work. And because cash flow is more manageable, you might be in a position where you can contemplate that next investment property as well. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.